Since the beginning of the NES era, the challenges of localizing Japanese games for foreign audiences has presented significant difficulty for Japanese developers and publishers. The situation is even further exacerbated by games which receive a limited localization, exposing a small number of foreign audience members to a game while the rest of the world remains unaware of its existence. Hey there folks, John here for Biddy Kong's Quest, and today we'll be talking about another one of these games. This is the story of Gimmick, a Famicom title which pushed boundaries in just about every conceivable way, only to be forgotten and buried by the company that created it, all because it came to market just a little bit too late. It's a story of creativity run wild in a mad dash to test the very limits of graphics, sound, difficulty, and even the Famicom hardware itself. And it would all end in the creation of one of the system's most sought after and yet most misunderstood titles. Fortunately, there's a happy ending to this one, but we have a long way to go before we get there. Here we go. Created in 1992 to directly compete with games on the newly released Super Famicom, Gimmick pushed boundaries in just about every conceivable way for a Famicom game created at the end of a console's life. To begin with, you play as a small yokai named Yumataro, who is mistakenly given to a little girl as a gift. When the toys in her room come to life and abduct her one night, Yumataro, armed only with the power to create a small star to throw at enemies, sets off on a quest to another dimension to save her. Technically speaking, the game is an absolute marvel for the era. Graphical optimizations were specifically written to break up the normal graphical limitations of the console and allow the NES to produce more color and detail than it really should have been capable of at the time. One look at the resulting graphical design proves that the trouble was totally worth it. As for sound, Gimmick would utilize a specially created, completely unique chip to allow greater depth and variety for composer Masashi Kageyama's musical score than any officially released NES title before or since. Kageyama took the development team's preferences into account when designing the music for Gimmick, with genres for songs ranging from pop to jazz to even hard rock and beyond.
In those days, you could only use 4 channels at a time, so it was a constant struggle. I couldn't use a lot of different timbres either due to the limited memory capacity of the ROM. I was forced to think about music as though it were a puzzle. You can't create an awesome sounding chord without using all 4 channels, but if you do, you won't be able to have any other sounds playing at the same time. So I tried creating chords using only 2 channels. In any case, I ended up learning a lot. Thanks to my experience doing game music, I now have a good sense of what sounds are truly necessary. Masashi Kageyama.
Because of Kageyama's dedication to creating something completely novel, the soundtrack for Gimmick holds a place of honor among NES and Famicom soundtracks, even to the present day. But an OST full of incredible songs isn't the only trick that Gimmick has up its sleeve. Creator and director Tomomi Sakai tried to push the game to its absolute limits in every conceivable way. Mechanically, this game is wholly unique among other games in the NES library, as Yumatomo's star is used not only as a weapon, but as a versatile platforming tool, and even a method of locomotion. The game requires extremely tight timing in some of its segments, especially if you want to see the best ending, which has made it something of a darling for high-level speedrunners. Seriously, if you've never seen a skilled player run this one, you have got to check it out. The talent on display is absolutely unreal. Speaking of the game's difficulty, Tomomi Sakai, the game's creator, went on record specifically saying that he wanted to make the game incredibly difficult so that only people who really master it can see the true ending. In practice, Sakai designed the game as if it was an arcade game rather than a home console game, and the difficulty was an intentional part of that design.
Arcade games aren't profitable if people can continue playing for long periods, so their level of difficulty is steeply curved. After a short period of time, the games will actually start to attack the player. However, there are also players capable of clearing the games, giving them a glimpse into an unseen world. Tomomi Sakai.
What's interesting to me about this is that in an era when games were made difficult because of technical limitations, or maybe even a desire to combat the rental market when a game was shipped overseas, here was Sakai, a guy who made extreme difficulty a part of the game's core design from the beginning. It's a clear example of his attitude towards game design as a whole. Games should be made with zero compromises, even if that means that players will never see the true ending. I can't emphasize enough how rare this would have been at the time, that a creator would design a game with the full knowledge and even the intent that most players would never see it through to the end. And yet Sakai felt that people would enjoy their time with the game, despite never being able to see the true ending. That's an extremely impressive level of confidence to have in your product. Speaking of quality, Tomomi Sakai worked with some other extremely talented people, Yoshiaki Iwata and Hiroyuki Kaguya of Blaster Master fame, to create Gimmick. Additionally, Sakai pulled in Naoisa Murata, who handled sound programming for many of Sunsoft's earlier titles, such as Blaster Master, Fantasy Zone, and Journey to Silius. You often hear people describe Sunsoft's games from this era as having a unique sound to their soundtracks, due to this deep, bassy instrumentation that you just didn't really find anywhere else. And it's safe to assume that most of that is probably due to Naoisa Murata's influence on the company's games. In short, many of the interviews used as source material for this video, including ones with Tomomi Sakai and Masashi Kageyama, refer to Mr. Murata as a genius in the field of sound programming. That's pretty high praise. And so, with his team assembled and some extremely ambitious goals in mind, the creation of Gimmick commenced. Once it was completed, it would stand as a technical marvel. But Sakai and his team would soon find out that the fruit of their efforts may have come just a little too late. Despite the incredible amount of talent and effort that went into Gimmick's creation, it was met with middling review scores upon release, and frankly, reviewers' opinions were all over the place. Some praised its graphics and sound, but also felt that the difficulty was way too high. Others felt that it was technically impressive, but ultimately dead on arrival, since the 16-bit era of gaming was already well underway. And when it came time for the game to be localized to other countries, this would become an even bigger problem.
At the time, most dealers wouldn't partner with us to distribute Mr. Gimmick. When we exhibited it at places like the Tokyo Toy Show, people would come up and ask, "Is this game for the Super Nintendo?" When they learned it was for the NES, they'd lose interest and walk away. And there I was, thinking I'd get a good response for making a next-gen game on the original Nintendo. Tomomi Sakai.
Still, the game would eventually see a limited release in Scandinavian countries over a year later, but not before executing a rebrand which would include changing the title to Mr. Gimmick, along with a rework of the game's art style. Reviews were once again middling and frankly inaccurate. Many publications praised the graphics and music like before, but they also felt the game was too easy.
Mr. Gimmick is one of those games that the kiddies can relate to. The levels are nicely detailed for a NES game, but with only 5 levels, the variety just isn't there. The music is kind of catchy, but wears thin after a while. The game plays rather well, however. The score would have been higher if it wasn't so easy. Sushi X, Electronics Gaming Monthly.
Clearly, reviewers didn't even give the game a chance, and most probably didn't even play past the first stage. A similar situation would happen with fellow Sunsoft title, Euphoria. I covered that story earlier this year, and I'll leave a link in the description down below if you want to check it out. It's a great story. Getting back to Gimmick, this limited European release would be the only localization outside of Japan to ever see the light of day. Sunsoft of America lost interest in localizing Famicom titles to the US shortly after the Super NES's launch in the country, and the game's momentum stopped there. As a result, the only international release that Gimmick would ever receive would be in Scandinavian countries, although at least one US prototype has been found in the years since, and the ROM has been dumped and uploaded to the internet for preservation. You can find it over at the Hidden Palace if you're interested. The game has been re-released a couple times over the years, including versions on the original Sony PlayStation as part of the Sunsoft Memorial Series, and more recently on modern consoles as both a digital and physical release. In 2020, a Gimmick remaster was created for the XA Arcadia platform, which made the game playable for the first time in arcade form. After that, the Gimmick franchise's story seemed to have come to an end, as the arcade release was more of a novelty than an actual reboot. That is, until earlier this year. On July 18, 2024, Clear River Games dropped a surprise trailer for Gimmick II, and it came out of nowhere. Then, shortly afterwards, they followed up with news that the legendary David Wise would be joining the team as the composer for the game, and I couldn't be more excited. I do suppose that it's not too surprising that Sunsoft would want to revisit the Gimmick franchise, as they've been having a bit of a resurgence lately with their Sunsoft is Back campaign. But even then, a full-fledged sequel is not what anyone had in mind. The game itself looks great, with smooth-looking animations and what seems to be a faithful interpretation of the original game's mechanics. It's also worth noting from a historical standpoint that Tomomi Sakai wasn't involved in the creation of Gimmick II in any way, and in fact he didn't even know about it until that initial announcement trailer in July of 2024. However, I have to say that having played quite a bit of it, it's clear that Clear River Games and Bitwave Games really tried to stay true to the spirit of the franchise. A physical release has been announced by Limited Run Games and should be available sometime in 2025. And I would bet that eventually you'll be able to find it on store shelves at some point as well, so you should be able to get a copy of it when it's made available. From the art style to the soundtrack to the physics engine, it's clear that the team at Bitwave Games did their absolute best to do justice to this legendary franchise. And that's where things stand today. Gimmick, the legendary franchise which pushed the Famicom to its absolute limits, is back in 2024, and I couldn't be more excited. As many of you know, videos like these take extensive research to put together, and I do want to take a minute to thank the archivists who provided translations of Japanese interviews with Gimmick's creators. Specifically, interviews with Tomomi Sakai and Masashi Kageyama came from GlitterBerri and VGM Online, respectively. Also, there's a lot of other great Gimmick information available on Hardcore Gaming 101, as well as the Cutting Room Floor, and both are excellent resources if you want to dive deeper into one of the Famicom's most impressive and interesting gaming stories. And speaking of stories, it's been an absolute pleasure sharing this story with all of you. We'll be back again, but until next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff, and I'll see you all next time.